I'm honored to represent the Jewish Week this evening and partner with our friends here at this beautiful, beautiful place at B'nai Jeshurun. And it's not often you get to spend time with a father and daughter duo who each started out at the New York Post and won Pulitzer Prizes for the New York Times. It's Clyde is a member of the New York Press Hall of Fame. Maggie is being called the queen of political journalism. We're going to find out how you like those kinds of descriptions. I think we're all curious to find out about if you, in your genes, if you like have a great grandparent who was the editor of the Chelm Chronicle or Chronicle, and it's also a rare treat for us to see that Maggie is not going to be on her phone tweeting for the duration of this program. So
there is internet in here. I was wrong, but I'm not going to.
I read that I'll start. I may as well jump right in. That when Corey Lewandowski was fired, I guess, was leaving his post, that you were at your son's kindergarten graduation. That's accurate, and
it's true.
And you wrote the story on your phone during the ceremony there.
That's also true, which is either a great journalism story or a bad parenting story, depending on how you look at it. And often great journalism stories are.
The grandparents were there, though.
Grandparents were there, so they took over. Great journalism stories sometimes are bad parenting stories. But no, that is true. And the phone is sort of omnipresent with me and always has been. But in the Donald Trump era, it's not really a choice. It's a mandate.
I understand. But, many of us here and probably many other readers of the New York Times, if we don't see, at least one or two bylines by you on the front page, we worry about you, if everything's okay. So, but you didn't disappoint us this morning. So this is a special treat. And I guess just by way, again, of introduction, we'd like this to be a little more interactive than just a Q&A. And more of a conversation. So I welcome you both interrupting each other or me or, commenting
that's
on each
familiar.
other.
Come to the right place.
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess for me as a journalist and for all of us as readers of the news at this very unique moment in our political and cultural history, we're anxious to hear about your perspectives on how the news is covered, how it's consumed, and Clyde, you sort of got started in the era of just the facts, ma'am, kind of more straightforward kind of reporting, where we learned yesterday's news today. And now we're in this era of instant, nonstop news coming at us from very different political extremes. And in a way, there's a lot more news available, but for many people, it's a lot more difficult to make sense out of it all and what's real and what's not real. So I wanted to start with your bios, and some of this information came from articles on the internet, so you'll correct me if, but Clyde is the, as you'll see, the consummate newspaper journalist. His association with the New York Times began in 1964.
First round, yes.
First round, yeah. So for English majors like me, that's like 54 years ago. That's.
And you're good at math too.
Okay. So Clyde was with the New York Post for a number of years, then returned to the Times in 1977. And among his many assignments were, just to give you an idea, editor of the Week in Review section, Metro reporter, City Hall bureau chief, foreign correspondent in Tokyo, Rome, and Jerusalem. During a time in the Jerusalem bureau, was during the Oslo Accords and
That's right.
the rise of Islamic terrorism, the aftermath of September 11th. He wrote a column twice a week back in New York, and in 2009 he was part of a Times team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news for the coverage of the scandal tied to Governor Spitzer and his resignation as governor. In 2011, he began writing a column called The Day for the New York Times Online, the City Room blog. And in 2014, he began writing an online series for the Times called Retro Report, linked with video documentaries exploring the long-term consequences of major news stories from the past. And in 2017, he served on the Times editorial board. So it's easy to see why you were inducted into the New York Press Club's Hall of Fame, and we welcome you.
Thank you.
Maggie, she's been called sad, a third-rate reporter, and a crooked Hillary flunky who I don't speak to and have nothing to do with by the President of the United States. But as far as we know, he's never stopped speaking with her, and she's part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize this year for reporting on the President's advisors and their connections to Russia. Now, Maggie, I understand you got your first byline when you were 7?
Yes. It was for the New York Daily News Kids section. My father was the City Hall bureau chief, as you've just noted, for the Times, and I think I was asking to meet Koch. Is that correct?
You may have. I don't remember that, but yeah, could be.
But
this was during Mayor Koch's first term in the early 80s.
And so I went into the mayor's office, and the city photographer took the official photographer took pictures. And in every single picture, I have my mouth open and I'm talking. And and the Daily News had a kids section at the time, and so I wrote a story, and that was my first byline.
Okay. But it seems that although it was in the family, that you were more interested in writing fiction after college. And
Right.
there's a quote I found that says, "The news was something my dad did."
And it was. I was not. Yeah, I didn't want to be a reporter. I wanted to write fiction, which became the punchline of a lot of jokes when I went to go work for the New York Post at first. But I had.
And from the president now.
I had wanted to. No, he likes the New York Post a lot. That would raise me in his eyes. I couldn't get a job at a magazine when I got out of college, and I was bartending to pay bills, and I started working as a copy kid at the New York Post, which is essentially a clerk, and you run page proofs from one desk to the next, and you get an editor coffee, and you sort mail, and you do this and you do that. But the Post has this tradition, and I think they still do, where every copy kid gets, if they want it, once a week you get a dedicated reporting day where you're a reporter for a day. And so it's usually, cops and firefighters. It's accidents, it's general assignment, and it's usually blood and guts, because that's a lot of what the tabloids are. But there's no experience like it in terms of becoming a reporter. And I fell in love with the newsroom almost immediately. Just the adrenaline, especially in 1990s New York Post was really something to behold. So.
Right. So I guess you covered Donald Trump since the tabloid days, right? When he was a real estate tycoon and.
Well, there's that line about Ed Koch that he was unavoidable for comment. Donald Trump was unavoidable for comment if you were at the tabloids, especially at the Post. The Daily News had a more complicated history with him, but I came to know him in a real way in 2011, at which point I was at Politico, and I had come from the Post when he was thinking of running for president, and I spent a lot of time covering the various machinations and who he was talking to and who he was meeting with. And I had what has turned out for me to be a seminal moment in understanding how upside down things can be covering him back then when I did an interview with Roger Stone, who has been a bit in the news these days. And Stone has been one of Trump's advisors for decades. And I knew that Stone was part of whatever these conversations were. But I did this interview with Stone on the record about what a Trump run would look like, how much money he would put in, how he would campaign. Stone gave me all these quotes about how Trump doesn't really like to work that hard. This article's on the internet if you want to find it. But the next day I got a call from Trump saying Roger Stone doesn't speak for me. And I was completely confused and couldn't understand exactly. I knew Stone was in these meetings, what was going on. That was the early introduction to a lot of what covering Trump is like.
Okay. And somehow you managed to cover the White House while living in New York and
I don't think
commuting a
under
lot?
most presidencies that would be possible, but it is under this one.
Yeah, and
So-
you have 3 young kids.
And I have 3 young kids.
Right. And you still beat the competition. Well,
Not as much as I'd like, but thank you.
okay.
Do what we can.
So, Clyde, you may be best known to the Jewish community for the years that you were based in Jerusalem and covering the Intifadas and Oslo Peace. You and I have talked about the kind of criticism that a person in that position as Jerusalem bureau chief gets from the Jewish community. Sometimes we like to compare who gets beat up more. I think I get beat up more often, but you probably got beat up in terms of volume and outrage. You beat me there. But I wondered if, the Jerusalem bureau chief must be one of the toughest assignments on the paper. Just your reflections on it, and if you think it makes it that much more difficult for a Jewish journalist to have that position.
Interesting questions. I would have said it's indeed the hardest job until this presidency, where I think that's changed the equation a lot. What Maggie and her colleagues covering this White House go through every day is quite extraordinary. It's probably harder for the Jerusalem bureau chief today. It happens to be a fellow named David Hauptfinger, because when I was, if we're just dealing with criticism, which I got a lot, I got it almost entirely from American Jews, not from Israelis, I might add, almost never from Israelis, but it was almost always from American Jewry, usually on the right of center portion, almost always, in fact, but very little criticism from those on the Palestinian side or the Muslim world in general. That, I think, has changed and why it's there. So now, in recent years, and I was the bureau chief, just so you know, the year is from 91 to 95, and then I went, so that included the Oslo period. And I went back for several months in 2001 during the so-called Second Intifada. And what had changed already by 2001, and is certainly more pronounced now, is that Muslim groups, Arab groups, Palestinian groups in particular, have also weighed in to a degree they never did. So the poor fellow or woman, we've had both, gets beaten up on all sides. It's not a pleasant experience. You made a reference when we were meeting before we went in. Some of my colleagues from other newspapers who did not have my yeshiva background could not understand why I was rocketed the way I was when I got several letters that were addressed to Clyde Haberman, and in parentheses it said Yemach Shemo. For those who don't know Hebrew, it means may his name be erased, and in my family those were used only for Hitler and Haman in the book of Esther, and I always thought that the only thing I had in common with those guys was that our names began with an H in English. So it was being Jewish was a mixed blessing, if you will, in that regard. It did allow me, though, to be able to call out folks like the present Prime Minister, who when I arrived in 91 was the basically Israel's ambassador to CNN. His formal title was Deputy Foreign Minister, but he was the Foreign Minister then was named David Levy, who spoke barely any known language, so including Hebrew. So Bibi made his name worldwide during the Gulf War earlier that year. My family moved to Jerusalem right after the Gulf War. And you may remember that the first President Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, were pushing Israel and the Arab states and the Palestinians very hard to various peace conferences. And in the bilateral end of it, there was a multilateral end, and the bilateral end, just between Israel and the PLO, it was like each took turns to decide why it wasn't going to go to the next round, why some insult had been done. And there was one scheduled in early December in 91 in Washington. And it was Israel's turn, I guess. It was still the Yitzhak Shamir government, a right-wing government. And they were making noises they didn't want to go. And Mr. Netanyahu asked to meet me in the lobby of the La Rome Hotel in Jerusalem to explain Israel's position. And he got very indignant and was saying that, it's very insensitive of the American administration to ask us to go do this during, our major holiday of Hanukkah. And I'm glad I got the laugh that I did, because, it's nonsense. Shtuyot in Hebrew, which is a little bit more vulgar than nonsense. And I said, look, why don't you save that for the Goyim? Because I am an old yeshiva bacher, and you know as well as I do that there ain't nothing you can't do during Hanukkah, religiously anyway. So that didn't fly. And that was my first encounter with the present Prime Minister. I've had others of a similar nature, I must add. Anyway, being Jewish, not being Jewish, the Times had a terrible policy for a long, long time of not sending a Jew to Jerusalem. It was an invidious policy, and our one-time executive editor, Abe Rosenthal, decided he was going to break this, and he did, but not quite as fast as he thought. He was going to send a fellow named David Shipler in the early 1980s there. He did send it, he announced it, and David Shipler, you have to understand, looks like he left a Jewish seminary yesterday. There's his name, it could be a Jewish name, and he looks like a fallen rabbinical student. And he was very proud, Abe was, that this was happening. And he went over to Joe Lelyveld, who would become executive editor years later, but was then the deputy foreign editor, and said, well, I finally did it. We're sending a Jew to Jerusalem. And Joe said, wait a second, I thought we're sending Shipler. And Abe said, what do you mean? And Joe said, what do you mean, what do I mean? And this went back and forth. And Abe had thought he was breaking it. Well, David is an Episcopalian. So they
But
had
he
to
had
wait.
a beard, right?
They had to wait for Tom Friedman, the next guy, to get the Jew. But I mentioned the Shipler thing because Jews are often not conspicuously nice to one another, I would argue. And Shipler once did a piece for the travel section. He used to get, as we all did, very, very nasty letters. It's probably worse in the era of Twitter, of course, and email and whatever. My main time there was just pre-email. Email came around about a year after I left Jerusalem. And, but Shipler told me this story years ago that there was one guy in particular in the States, who would send really vicious letters, absolutely awful. And then David was asked by the travel section to do a piece on Christmas time in the Holy Land. And he did. And he talked about standing on the Mount of Olives and overlooking Gethsemane and Bethesda and what it meant to him and all. And a couple of weeks later, he got a letter from the same guy that began, Dear Mr. Shipler, I am so sorry. I had no idea you weren't Jewish. what do you do? It was easy to, on one hand, say, okay, be dismissive of the criticism, but it's hard, as a famous fictional Jew said, if you prick me, do I not bleed? It was an unusual experience. Look, I've been a reporter, columnist, whatever you want, editorial writer for more than half a century. And I've usually gotten my share of letters, emails, whatever. I've had my share of, you're an idiot, that's for sure. But also my share of, hey, that was an interesting story. That was a good piece. You made me laugh. You did this, you did that. Swear to God, 4.5 years in Israel total, never once got a letter like that, never once got anything except criticism in a letter. And you have to answer, did I really reserve my awfulness for those 4 years? So
Clyde,
it's a tough one.
I remember, and I'm sure you remember as well, it was the height of the Second Intifada. The Jewish Week did a program on media coverage of Israel and the Middle East. And it was at an Orthodox synagogue on the Upper West Side. It was packed, standing room only.
It's initials of the Jewish Center.
This is all on the record.
Happens to be true.
Sidney Zion, the late Sidney Zion, was the darling of the crowd, and poor Clyde was getting beat up. All the questions were aimed at the New York Times, so it was all at Clyde about coverage. And what was most memorable, the woman got up and in a sharp voice, she said, the PLO is training young kids with guns. They have a camp for kids. Why don't you write about that? And Clyde said, well, we had it on the front page like 3 weeks ago, and she didn't even miss a beat, and she said, well, why don't you write it again? And Clyde said, well, why don't you stop reading the New York Times? So as far as how this does or doesn't affect your Jewish identity or your relationship beyond that, does...
Not at all, no.
Okay.
No, it doesn't affect my Jewish identity one bit. But I was aware that I was not an Israeli. And that was a difference. Look, I had more Yiddishkeit in me than any prime minister of Israel thus far, and that's just a fact. And Yitzhak Rabin, of blessed memory, anytime he had a yarmulke on, and it really wasn't even it was sort of like the kind that you get at a bar mitzvah, where, it has, the Goldstein family thing on the inside. He had never looked like it was natural to him. It always looked funny. Being Jewish, and it was, I don't know if folks in this audience would agree with this at all, but as long as I can spin a yarn here. One of the things that got to me as a Jew there was, again, we arrived in '91. The Soviet Union was collapsing. And so an awful lot of countries, both in the communist bloc and under its thumb, were either beginning for the first time or resuming diplomatic relations with Israel that had been suspended since roughly the 1973 war, or even the '67 war. And so there was a flock of visitors, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and the like. And the Foreign Ministry of Israel would send out the schedule each time. I virtually never covered any of these except maybe a broad piece on it. But the schedule was almost always the same. They would drive up the hill to Jerusalem from Ben Gurion Airport, drop their bags off at the King David Hotel, and then be immediately whisked off to Yad Vashem, the memorial. And at some point, there's the Holocaust Memorial. And it began to bother me and I never wrote about this, but I mentioned this after I came back home. I was giving a talk somewhere, and the former mayor, Ed Koch, was there. I had covered him for years, and even before Maggie interviewed him. And I said at one point, I recall this, and I said, it began to bother me. I said, because I know why they were doing it, but we're a people with a few thousand years of history and literature and faith, and it bothered me that, is this how we were going to define ourselves exclusively, or primarily anyway, by those who wanted to annihilate us? And I mentioned it, I did say this, and Ed came up to me afterwards rather disturbed. Now we're of different generations. He was of the World War II generation. And he said, well, what else would be a more defining thing for us than the Holocaust? And I repeated, there's literature, there's the Torah, for goodness sakes, there's Rabbi Hillel and Shammai, and go down the roster. So I felt, my Jewishness didn't translate automatically to me anyway into Israelness, if you will. I don't know if that makes sense, but there you have it.
I just saw a statistic in the last week or so that more than 70% of Jewish museums in the world are Holocaust related. And there's an effort now to create a world Jewish museum in Tel Aviv that is a much broader,
Good.
Broadway comedy and Jewish culture. But we'll see how that goes.
We need a Jack Benny museum in Tel Aviv. Then we'll know we'll have arrived.
Maggie, did you spend much time in Israel when your dad was there? I wonder if you had any impressions.
I didn't spend much time there at all, actually. 91 to 95 was the period when I was in college, and had more time when I could sort of set my own schedules for the summers. When we were younger and my father was in Italy and Japan before that, my brother and I would go visit him every summer and every what the public schools called then Christmas vacation. And but so by the time he was in Israel, I think I probably spent a total of a month there over the 4 years of that.
It was, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was not. No, my deepest impressions, frankly, of Israel were the stories that he would tell, of his time in Israel were the stories that he would tell once he had returned. And particularly, I think that it was the fact that Rabin was assassinated. I think it was 2 months after you left. Is that right?
Yeah, 2 or 3 months, but yeah, right.
Right.
I seem to have a knack for not being around for the big story. I was in Japan for 5 years, and Emperor Hirohito died like 4 months after we left there. There's a pattern here. Anyway.
But the impressions that it left on me were more actually about journalism than about Israel. And then I have a very vivid memory of when he did this, and I think he referenced it before, this return tour in Israel for how long was that, in 2001?
About 3 months
3 months.
altogether.
That he had my brother and me over for dinner on September 9th, 2001, and he was talking about how female suicide bombers were becoming much more visible and much more in use and trained, and then 2 days later, obviously, the world changed.
Yeah. My wife and I were at a wedding a few days before in Israel, and very nervous about the Intifada, and came back on the 9th. And so there's a Showtime series now about the New York Times coverage of the first year of the Trump presidency. For those of you who have opportunity to watch it.
You shouldn't take it. No, I'm just kidding.
What's that?
I said you shouldn't take that opportunity, and then I said I was kidding.
I disagree. It's actually interesting. But okay.
Well, you play a pretty prominent role in this documentary, and I have only seen the first one, but you look tired much of the time.
Then or now? Because it's pretty consistent.
No, not now. Hassled, and there's a very poignant scene where I think you're in a recording studio or something, and you take time out to talk to one of your kids, and you just get the sense of the kind of frenzied existence you have. And I guess one of the questions I had was, how you feel as a reporter, being so front and center in our culture now, or would you rather just do the reporting? How does it sit with you?
It sits very poorly, and I appreciate you asking the question. No, I'm being serious. I mean, I was listening to your description of my dad as the consummate newspaper reporter, and that is the culture that I grew up in, which is you don't, there's that famous line that I was saying to my father again yesterday from broadcast news, which holds up very well 30 years later. Where
you're Holly Hunter, so
I wasn't thinking of it that way. But Albert Brooks is looking at a TV piece that William Hurt has just shot, and William Hurt has put a shot of himself in the piece. And Albert Brooks says, yes, let's never forget, we're the real story, not them. And that's my guiding principle has always been, obviously, we are not the story. I think one of the problems, there's two problems right now, four. Twitter, Twitter, the fact that a bunch of us are on TV as commentators now, I think, has changed things, and it makes commentary bleed in a little bit, and we all really need to be mindful of that, those of us who have this crossover. And then there's the fact that Trump tends to make everyone around him sort of known, whether it's those of us who are reporting on him or Sean Spicer. It's just an occupational hazard around him. But I think that the main reason why the Times did this, and I found it incredibly uncomfortable to be a part of it, but I also thought the goal was noble and important. I always thought people understood what we do as journalists, and they don't. And that's what 2016, particularly the WikiLeaks email hacks, really taught me. One of Trump's genius is he sort of rips process from context and makes it appear sort of sinister. And so I think when you have a president who's calling us fake news all the time, what you do, I hope, take away from that documentary is journalists who I think are taking the story very seriously and trying very hard to get it right. And we are obviously not succeeding every time, and we're not going to. But where we mess up, we correct the record, and we are trying.
If I could just say, I've seen all four segments, and if anything, it really does underscore how diligent all these reporters are. And as a parent, I wish my daughter had a few fewer F-bombs in one of those segments. But that's
I just won my bet with myself as to whether you would bring that up. So thank you.
You knew I couldn't resist. But
I forgot that my parents might be watching that thing someday, or my children.
It happens. But that aside, no. But seriously, I mean, these are folks who take their responsibility seriously. Now, granted, I'm a company boy. You could take what I say or leave it. But this notion of fake news is of itself fake. Do they get it right all the time? Of course not. Might the evaluation and the weighing of certain things be off? Sure. The last time I looked, this newspaper and every other one is put out by human beings, which means they're fallible. But they're not that fallible, and they're quite serious about what they do, especially when they're dealing with the President of the United States, no matter who he, or maybe someday she, is. And that's what I came away with, frankly, from watching this series.
The other thing that I wish people would take away from it, but I don't know that they're going to, because it's not a very overt point, but a president who calls us fake news spends an awful lot of time paying attention to us and talking to us and so forth. And there is an aspect of this that is a game to him, and he thinks this is fun. And he he never thinks about, if he thinks about consequences at all, it's always the first order consequence. There are serious consequences to what he's doing with the constant fake news, fake news, fake news. And some are nuanced and some are more apparent. But what I would hope people would take away from it is that the person who is leveling that complaint all the time can't really be that serious about it, given how he engages with us.
But there are those who say, I don't know if there's a fair analogy about, that Israel is using disproportionate amount of force and in its clashes, but that the Times is, writing critical stories about Trump all the time. I think reporters would say that this is what's happening. But is there an element of worrying about how that perception is, or even from the show where, you see editors and reporters who look pretty excited about, writing about some of the problems Trump is having? How much do you take that into account, or not?
I think it's a great question. I think that what you're seeing in the documentary about people being excited is people are excited about a good story. And so good reporters will be excited about a good story no matter what it is. I remember in 2001, I think it was April, somebody close to then Mayor Giuliani telling me, you should call XYZ tomorrow because Donna Hanover, his then wife, is getting a letter, and she may have gotten it already, saying she's fired as First Lady. And I didn't wait until the next day. I started making calls that night. And when we got the story, my immediate thought was, oh my God, what a story, which it's a pretty terrible topic. But, it was still a remarkable story. That's what we are in the business of doing. So I think that's a lot of what people are seeing. I do think that, look, I think that the way you described it is accurate, which is that we are covering what is there. To Trump and his supporters, that ends up looking unfair. There is a lot of debate right now over how the news media covers Trump. And I think that it's a legitimate debate to have, and I think that there are legitimate complaints. But Trump tends to infuse everything with this kind of up-down, easy referendum. And, it's positive, it's negative. I mean, sometimes this is just what the facts are, and if they're not, in his mind, positive, that is what it is. I think we are mindful of tone, and I think we are mindful of not going overboard, but we're talking about a president who is under investigation for obstruction of justice and possible collusion with Russians. I don't know what planet that's like an easy, what's the positive story on that? I mean, so if he will either be cleared or he won't, and I think we're just covering it as it comes across.
Not to mention that already a fair number of his team have been indicted,
right,
and pleaded guilty. If I could just add to that, in this age of social media, I think we're more exposed in a way. I was going to say transparent, but that word may have a different meaning for a lot of people. The process of reporting is not a linear process, as it sometimes might seem in movies about newspapers or TV. And it's often not pretty necessarily. I can't think of any major interview that I've ever done that had a question A led to question B to C and so on. It was all over the map, and then you put pieces together. What may look like a hash to an outside observer is just a normal way that people talk to each other and ask questions of one another most of the time. So it's not a pretty process necessarily, not because it's inherently ugly, but just it's like watching the sausage being made, to use an old cliche. That's not a pretty sight either, but it doesn't make the product a bad thing.
No, but one thing that I would say, just to your point about transparency, I mean, this I think is transparency over exposure, and this began in the campaign, and we all still do it. When there is an interview with Trump, we print the whole transcript, because the way he talks makes it impossible, honestly, it's not impossible, it's very difficult to really capture it in a traditional news story. And so I cannot think of any other candidate, certainly, but president, maybe it's a little different now, but certainly candidate where every transcript of every interview, these would be hours long sometimes, would be printed. And so when people say, you guys didn't really do a good job of showing us who he is, I think we did. I think that voters chose him, but I do think that we are trying to be as transparent as we can.
So some describe your role as sort of the Trump whisperer.
I reject that.
Okay. Well, but
title.
I don't know if that's the wrong phrase, but even in the first episode of the series, there's a scene where you're sort of early on. It might be right after the inauguration, sort of explaining to other colleagues and editors, how Trump works, or what he takes seriously, what he doesn't. Is that just something that you acquired from dealing with him for a number of years, and he hasn't really changed? Do you still see this as a celebrity thing, a political piece?
He's he is who he is. He has not changed at all in office. Some things have become more exacerbated and more visible, but yeah, it was just from going back to that Roger Stone story from 2011. Like that's what dealing with this world is like. That's what he's actually pretty. One of the things that has continued to be fascinating, watching Washington try to deal with him. I don't mean the New York Times Washington Bureau. I mean the collective Washington mind. Is there's always this belief that there must be some jujitsu going on, or some strategy going on, or some three-dimensional chess. And it's more often like 10-dimensional checkers. I mean, it's just not. It's what you see is what there is. And
but you refer to his brilliance also. I mean, is there a brilliance?
There is a genius there. It's just that it's a genius that I think a lot of people don't view as genius in the conventional sense of the word. Look, he's really good at branding, right? You saw that. He's really good at seeing what the skim is going to be and pulling that toward him, forgetting about what might be deeper. He views reality as whatever he says reality is. I am not saying this as condoning this. I'm just telling you this is what it is. In an interview once, I described it as the children's book Harold and the Purple Crayon, where Harold draws his own city as he's walking around at night. I mean, Trump believes reality is what he tells you it is and what he feels it is. And he's been pretty candid about that, certainly as relates to his net worth in depositions. He'll base it on mood and feel and how much he thinks his bank account is at any given moment. So, which is incredibly difficult for journalists. We deal in facts. So when you're covering a president who doesn't really deal in facts or even necessarily believe in facts, that's very complicated. But he hasn't changed at all, and whatever deep meaning people tend to ascribe to what he's saying or doing, it's usually something pretty simple. So, for instance, the pardons that he did the other day. I was on Air Force One when this all happened, and he started. We were asking him about his pardon of Dinesh D'Souza, who has not been in the news recently. And we asked him, how did that case get to you? And he said, I just saw it. That isn't true. Ted Cruz brought it to his attention. But I think he still doesn't really like Ted Cruz that much. And I think he also doesn't want to give somebody else credit, which are two of his hallmarks. But then he said, and there's another one I'm thinking of, Rod Blagojevich. And I thought, what? And we all sort of looked at each other. There were 7 of us. And we were in the president's cabin, which is his office, and he almost never brings reporters up there. And he said, yeah, I just think it was so unfair what was done to him. And one of us asked if he knew him or something, and he said, well, you know what, just a little bit on The Apprentice. And I thought, okay. So, I mean,
it's about the hair.
Right, that too. But it's usually just something kind of right there in front of you.
Can I just add that, Maggie has been consistent for several years now saying he is who he is and don't expect change. A lot of folks, I was one of them, thought, okay, he's president and he's going to be, the office, I've always felt, will elevate a person. I think I was wrong on this one. But she never was. I mean, the point is, he's unchangeable,
Right.
and hasn't, or at least hasn't changed. I don't know. I suspect he is unchangeable, but I'll say he hasn't changed. And she's been absolutely firm on this right from the get-go. So this is not a new thing that's come about. If people would only have read her sharply, as they should have, they would have seen this going on for coverage now for the past 3 years since he first announced his candidacy.
If anything, he is changing the presidency, and then I think the question becomes whether it's a durable change or something that reverts back later. But my bet is that whoever comes next tries to take a fair number of liberties they might not have taken otherwise.
So you've written some page one stories that seem to be kind of break the mold of the Times in the kind of reporting. Maybe some critics would say you brought the tabloid part into it, but memorable images of like the president walking around in his bathrobe at night at the White House and yelling at the TV. Hopefully it was on.
He wasn't talking to the paintings. So.
Yeah. How do you respond to that? Is that it just a natural way to cover it, or?
I understand that. I guess what I would ask is, what is the policy in that first month that people thought we should have been covering differently, that we weren't, or that we were ignoring somehow? The travel ban got ample coverage. He is not a president with a consistent ideology or coherent belief system. He doesn't have a particularly solid core of ideals. He's incredibly swayed by what other people think. And frankly, the kind of reporting that we did, I think, taught people about who he is more than almost anything could have. So that's what I say.
Right. So Clyde, would those kinds of stories be written, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s?
Yeah, I think to some degree. It depends, sure. He's obviously a different sort of president than predecessors, but we did these, and so did other papers did these pieces before. It's not. If anything, though, stories have to be more analytical, I guess, than they were in the past. Now, what is analysis and what is opinion? We can go 20 rounds on that, I guess, and probably not come to a resolution. But the paper, and increasingly it's not the physical paper, but still, there are 600,000 or more people who subscribe to the print paper, and more on Sunday, that lands on your doorstep, can't tell you things that you knew almost 24 hours earlier. It's got to go deeper. It's got to explain more what it means. To bring it back to Israel, which I assume would be of interest here, when the internet first came into our lives, you may remember, I went out to Teaneck when you lived there. There was a group of folks who would talk about the Times, and there were the suicide bombings were still going on, and one person was very upset because the Times' story that morning, and by then I was not in Israel. The physical paper might say something like Israeli forces raided someplace in Jenin or Ramallah or wherever in response to a terrorist strike that killed 12 Israelis the day before. Why, she wanted to know, are you focusing on the response instead of the brutality that prompted the response? A fair question, but only up to a point, because in those cases that she was talking about, those were incidents that took place in the early afternoon in Israel. So it was about 7 in the morning here on the East Coast, which means that people were waking up or getting ready to go to work, and they were hearing about it. And then, and so they were hearing it on TV, and by then the papers had websites, so it was on the websites. The physical printed paper that's going to be on their doorstep a full 24 hours later, we might as well just go out of business if we simply repeated that which they'd known for 24 hours. What was new was that overnight in the Middle East, Israeli forces went in or whatever. It's a function of what we know. Maybe the problem is maybe we don't explain ourselves well enough. I'm told that the Times did surveys on what readers know, whatever, and was stunned to find out that a lot of people didn't even understand what a dateline was. You know, that when it said Kabul, Afghanistan, it really meant that our reporter, whose byline was above it, is physically in Kabul. A lot of people think it's just a subject line, and so maybe the problem is civics classes are. We all know that social studies is painfully wounded in an awful lot of schools, and not being taught as looking around this room, and most of us were taught when we were in school. But so maybe that's the issue. I don't know, but it's not done with some political thinking in it, and that's the same issue to some degree that they would have in terms of Trump blurting out something, or let's just take the Roseanne business the other day. So that all breaks early, sort of mid-morning, if I remember right. Well, what are the stories supposed to say for, again, that newspaper on your doorstep the next morning? Just simply say she came out with this racist tweet? No, everybody knows it already. So it has to go further.
I think the other point that I would add to that, and I completely agree with that, is I mentioned before that I think a lot of people don't know how journalism works. And to your point about the Dateline thing, I remember being stunned by that
It's shocking.
when we were told. And yet the number of people who believe they know what journalism is supposed to be is at an all-time high. And so I think it's complicated because I want to, and I think my father does too, I want to engage with people in good faith. That also doesn't mean that every criticism is on the level, and I'm not going to treat every criticism like it is. So.
Is it sort of the motivation to tweet as often as you and others do? Is that driven? How much of it is a business part of it, where we have to keep pushing out something fresh, or is it more about the news itself? And I guess the other question is, how much more latitude do you have in a tweet than writing something, in an article in terms of opinion? Where do you sort of draw the line of how much you can put yourself in there?
The answer is we shouldn't really have that much latitude. And sometimes I fall into. I mean, I'm a really bad tweeter. I am a good reporter, but I am not a good tweeter, in the sense that I sometimes fire something off too fast, or I don't think about how in 140 characters or 280 characters, the one misplaced word is really going to change the meaning dramatically.
So those don't get seen by anybody else?
No, we're not edited. Tweets are not edited. The safest thing, and I have started doing more of it, is just, and I used to do it all the time, is just tweet out links. Just tweet out the links to stories that you think are worthwhile. It's funny, because when my husband joined Twitter, and he reminded me of this the other day, I was the one who kept saying to him, be very careful, don't. And in 2012, when Twitter was really used for the first time across the board in a campaign, I was really horrified at how the younger reporters were using it. And I sounded like I was 100 years old, but they would do things like the embeds would tweet, meaning the reporters who were embedded into the campaign, they would tweet pictures of themselves covering events. And I was like, these are news platforms, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. But that's, a physician heal thyself moment sometimes too. I think at the end of the day, I think it's really worth remembering that the majority of people are not on Twitter. And so it can really be diminishing returns.
But there have been, if I could just add, the standards editor at the time, a fellow named Phil Corbett, has periodically sent out a note telling people, basically wagging a finger and saying, these are getting too opinionated, not speaking about Maggie in this case, but some others. And I'm not in the newsroom on any regular basis anymore, that there is some pushback indeed from younger reporters on this. There is a different understanding of what we're all about. They grew up with these forms
Yes.
from birth. For me, somebody my age, I'm on Twitter fairly actively, but it's still a semi-alien culture, if you will.
Well, look at what happened to Roseanne. I mean, I would think people would be a lot more cautious about one.
Yeah, I don't think the tweet was the problem. I think it was the sentiment.
Yeah, exactly. Nor
Well,
was
if
the
somebody had edited-
Ambien.
No, I mean, if somebody had seen it before she put it
Yes.
out there.
Yeah.
That's
No,
all.
no, that's very true.
A known side
yeah.
effect of Ambien is racism.
Twitter can be Twitter can be very useful as a reporter. For instance, if you have material that you didn't get in your story, as long as you have told your editor you're going to do this. It can be very useful for laying down a marker on something that's competitive, that's about to break, that you know a competitor is about to break. These are really incremental bits of advantage, but in the internet era, they do matter. So.